Today, I am joined by executives from two global cybersecurity providers, as well as an Accenture executive who has customers across the world, whom he advises on themes including cybersecurity. Obviously, cybersecurity is one of those more stress-inducing themes for a lot of executives. And one of the reasons why that is because we're seeing what seems to be a rise in protectionism in cybersecurity. Now, there are three reasons why I say that, three current themes which we're talking about a lot. One of them is GDPR, obviously. And with GDPR, we're seeing Europe take a kind of distinctive stance on data privacy versus the rest of the world. The other trend we're seeing is the US-China relationship with regard to tech, which is complicated, to say the least, and for security reasons, according to the US. The third theme that I've noticed recently is some European companies are positioning themselves as trusted third parties between their European customers and US tech providers, with the idea that their customers based in Europe want to keep their data within European hands. And so within that context, I'm going to start the discussion by turning to Floris and saying, is there a rise in cybersecurity protectionism?
Well, I think you just summarized it, so the answer can only be yes. And I guess Friday is the big day for us in Europe with GDPR taking effect. And it's a logical movement, as you just described. I mean, governments are trying to take a stance. I've had many discussions over the past couple of years with EU agencies, and they've been waiting for industry to take matters into their own hand, waiting for self-regulation, for industry to improve. The problem with cybersecurity, of course, is it costs money. So why, if I'm a telco, why would I invest millions and millions if my competitors are not doing it in security, unless I'm told by the government that I do need to invest? And unfortunately, that is what we now see in Europe that is really driving a lot of the legislation. The government is basically forcing industry to take certain protective measures. You can wonder, and maybe we'll have time to talk about that, if they are the right measures to really protect corporates. It will help us to put certain priorities on the map, that's for sure.
What about you, Eddie? When you speak with customers, is this something that's popping up in conversations more often?
There's no question everyone's concerned about GDPR. I think the issue of data sovereignty or protectionism has definitely cropped up. For example, national security related issues. There's been sort of concern for years now about the security of crypto keys, with governments sort of tampering with crypto in different parts of the world. And so if my data is in the US or my data is in another country, are the crypto keys that are used to store that data actually valid or accessible by a foreign government? Or could the foreign government subpoena my data if I'm, let's say, another government or a bank or something like that? And so that creates now protectionism, which is actually in some ways breaking the promise of cloud and the promise of other models that were actually helpful to the growth of digitization. So we're definitely seeing those concerns, and we're seeing the cloud providers scramble to try to say, well, no, actually, we'll do other things with the crypto keys, or we'll do other things to try to alleviate those problems. So I think that's a work in progress. It's not just about the issue of consumer privacy, which is certainly a huge concern relative to individual consumers and how that data is handled, but it's also the larger issues of enterprises and government agencies around, can I even trust the national security and other issues associated with this data?
Meerah, I mean, you're raising a sort of very valid point, which is, who is pushing this sort of need for regional or national preference? Is this something that's coming from the regulatory side? Is this something regulators want? Or is this something that customers and enterprise want? What are you seeing?
I think it's a combination. The reason I say it's a combination is, if you kind of think about what digitization has brought to us and what cloud has brought to us, it's a very powerful animal, in my opinion. And the taming of that animal was not something that we imagined how it should happen, and it started running out of control. And if you kind of think about individual rights, what is the convenience versus what I'm willing to compromise? Did people really understand when they say, I'm giving my privacy rights to you, how you're going to use my privacy rights? That's from an individual point of view. Then when you take that same thing in the corporate point of view, you're human, your employees are your vulnerability. I mean, when we talk about, Florence brought a very good point, that companies are thinking why I should spend on security, but there is a very good point on if your brand is important, you do want to spend on security to make sure that there is no brand erosion from any of the breaches happening. So from an enterprise point of view, if I have an employee who's a vulnerable employee, then I'm exposing my company. It's not anymore just as a corporate perimeter walls, because the recent analysis shows 87% of devices that are used in the corporate are personal devices. I mean, people are not using corporate provided assets, which means you really have to prepare in this boundaryless world. Your individuals, your human-centric security becomes an important point. And then comes the regulation at the national level. There's a level of protectionism, I would say it's there, but it's also, again, it comes back to the balance between how do I protect the national interest versus the global economical interest.
But would you say that in the world of sort of post-Facebook, Cambridge Analytica scandal, that this sort of awareness that seems to be arising quite late actually within the greater public of, who has my data, who has access to it, who's keeping it safe or not? We've had a lot of security breaches over the past, mega security breaches globally over the past few years that have sort of awakened individuals to the theme of cybersecurity. Would you say that companies are a little bit ahead of the curve, and are executives and professionals a little bit ahead of the curve in thinking about this, or are they waking up just now as well?
I wouldn't really call we are ahead of the curve. To be honest, I think we are probably catching up. Very few can even classify themselves as ahead of the curve. I mean, Equifax, individually it affected the individuals, right? I mean, the Equifax breach really brought to my personal identity is now out there, my social security number or my whatever the national ID is out there. That's actually a huge deal. Now it's personal to me. It's not about the company. It's not about the government. And that actually created the awareness at an individual to say, okay, I do need to care about security. I do need to worry about which organization is keeping my data, and are they ones I want to trust? I mean, trust is an interesting, tricky animal, right? It's easy to lose, but regaining trust is a very important thing. So even if we take the Cambridge Analytica and Facebook event, for example, I know many friends who started telling, I don't want to be putting too much on it because I don't know who else is seeing my life, right? So I think the awareness has gone up, but I would also say at the same token, take example, how many times we have said, I agree on license agreements. It's 20 to 60 pages, and nobody reads it. We are saying, yes, I agree. In the last week, I got close to maybe 20 or 30 saying, hey, we want you to consent to our privacy. Can you please say acknowledge? And I think to some extent people are getting aware, but it's not simplistic. So I don't think I agree is really giving them that awareness. They know that I need to care about it, but they still don't know the next layers beneath it, in my opinion.
Yeah, it's been one of the ironic things with GDPR is we've gotten masses of emails asking us to opt in yet again, whereas we were expecting something else, I guess, from GDPR at this point. Floris,
I was just going to say, just latch on to this point, that trust, I think, is the key word. I mean, yes, we talk a lot about security, and I'm a security professional, so I'm passionate about it, but in the end, it's really about trust and resilience. And I think management is starting to wake up to that.
Yeah.
They realize that we're in the middle of this digital transformation. We want to do business online in a digital world. So we need to build or maintain trust that we already had in the physical world, and how do we translate that into the online world? And that's actually where something like GDPR can help, if you treat it in a proper way. And frankly, the tidal wave of emails everyone is now receiving feels more like a marketing campaign than like a trust-building exercise. And frankly, I'm wondering if some companies are not taking advantage of it to send an email saying, oh, I can still get you on my mailing list if you give consent now. Because I'm seeing emails from companies that I didn't even know I was on their email list, and I probably am not. But then it's also about resilience, and I think that's where a lot of legislation at the moment is not addressing it. Because if I want to have trust with a company, I also want them to be resilient. I want them to be in service. And GDPR is not about that. It's not about business continuity and things like that. It's only about that small part of the trust equation that's protecting personal data, which is important, but that's not the whole story.
as we're on the topic of GDPR and Europe, I have a good question from the audience. Do you think European companies place the same importance on cybersecurity as their US counterparts? And if not, what can be done about that? I see a head shaking there. What do you think?
I think that's a fair question. I mean, I think at least the enterprises and government agencies that I've worked with in Europe do have the same emphasis and awareness. I think they operate in a more complex regulatory environment when it comes to certain technologies that would enhance their efforts relative to security, where they may not be able to utilize those technologies in the same way. For example, deep packet inspection and other technologies that would give them greater insight. So they have a more complex problem in terms of the execution, let's say. But I think the concerns of security professionals and certainly people in the management chain are there. I don't think somehow they're not concerned. I think one of the things I wanted to mention to your earlier point, if I may briefly, is just that the thing to keep in mind, you mentioned sort of our users aware, our consumer aware. There's this awareness continuum, which is really important to think about. The awareness actually starts with the bad guys. The bad guys are aware of this digitization potential that Floris referred to, where they see everything we're doing that's good. And they're already doing the AI and ML research, and they're doing all of the good stuff. And they don't have the constraints like GDPR. They don't have the limitations that we have. And they're also doing DevOps, and they're doing it in a worldwide, collaborative, transparent sort of way. And then we, have this continuum, which includes government agencies, companies like Accenture and Forcepoint and mine, that are trying to do our best to come up with strategies and frameworks and solutions. And then you have government agencies and banks that are leading cybersecurity, and some of them are doing very good. And then you have, consumers and regulators that are going, why is this all happening? And so it's a continuum of that includes time and effort and money and everything that's very complicated. And we have to break that at some point. We have to just disrupt it completely.
So who are the bad guys in your example, just to be clear?
Oh, that's a complex question, isn't it? Well, I mean, there's sort of absolutes, right? I mean, certainly in some of the examples that we've seen where people have saved for their whole life and they're losing money, or that their identities are stolen and it's disrupting their families or the ways of life in some way, or the power grids being turned off or things like that. I mean, I think those are intrinsic examples of bad. I think there's, there are gray areas that become very, very complicated to discuss when you get into geopolitical issues, and I'm not a politician, so.
Meerah,
I was just about to add one of the point to Eddie said was, to me, it's really coming down to, the taking trust and resiliency into the equation is how much friction we are going to introduce into the system in trade for control, right? I mean, example, the zero trust is actually a model beyond the perimeter is the model that's getting taught quite a bit. Don't trust anything. You have to attest and validate and identify on every step. That's great, but it puts so much friction from a user point of view in every step you go through. And the more friction we try to introduce, and as a corporate person, I can tell people are very creative. They're going to find way around. And in trade of control, you put friction, and eventually you're going to lose the control because the friction is the value, the user point of view is too high. They're going to walk around it, and users are creative, right? So to me, when we talk about this whole digital economy and when we look at this, it's really the balance we need to figure out. How do we balance the friction with the control? And also, how do we ensure it's not static, right? I mean, to Eddie's point, good and bad, it's easy to distinguish. And if you take a continuum, it's a little bit good. You can clearly say, here is a malware, it's bad. But there's a huge in the middle, that's the context. Without context, it's a gray area. And we really need to, when you talk about AI and ML and big data today, security is a big data problem. So when you take that middle, we really need a context to it. Whether you introduce the context from a human-centric point of view, that's what Forcepoint advocates, because we truly believe the threats are not anymore the only vector we can look at it. We need to have perimeter protection. We need to have email protection. But if you don't know your user behavior, and if you just introduce only friction, you're going to lose control. Having the anomaly and understanding your user behavior will make it even smoother from a friction point of view without losing control.
We're going to get a bit more into that sort of impossible equation that the CIO has to figure out between, protecting on one hand and keeping people safe and their data safe and the company safe, and on the other hand, just making everything impossible to use and friction, full. But first, I want to go to the audience for a poll question. On this theme of cybersecurity protectionism, and within the context of GDPR, I'm sure you all thought about this in recent weeks and months. Now, I want to know, who do you trust more or most with your data and your security needs? Would it be a company that's based in the US? Would it be a comparable rival that's based in Europe? A company from China, from the UAE or Middle East? Or do you not care where the company is based?
Sorry, Eddie.
I know.
Interesting. We're seeing a clear trend show up there.
Well, we're a bit
Apparently
biased.
you
We're
all
a bit
trust
biased
Europe.
here, I guess. But
Yeah. I guess if we'd been in Germany, maybe that Europe choice would have been even
Dubai.
further
Or-
ahead.
or
I have
in
to
the
say,
UK.
I'm surprised though. I may have expected that, because we're all sort of exposed to these themes every day, we may, be a little bit more skeptical of the importance of where a company is based. But it seems like it's still an important theme. And to that point, you're yes.
the
sorry,
interesting thing about these kind of questions, if you ask those questions, you see those kind of responses that you sort of expect, but it doesn't show in our buying behavior. I mean, we're all on. We still use a lot of services from American companies, partly because there are no European alternatives. But our buying behavior and our service, the way we consume services, it tells a different story than what we're seeing in those answers.
Do you think if we'd asked that same question in the US, we would have had a majority of US?
Of course.
Yeah, you think so?
Yeah.
Probably.
And so what happens, you're based, DarkMatter is based in the UAE. What's the vision there? Is there a national preference, a sort of regional preference? And
No question, but I mean, the interesting part about our workforce is it's more than 80% expatriates, and it's people from 60 different countries. So I mean, you probably wind up having 57% Europeans and 17% Americans working on your stuff anyway, is the reality. Or I don't know that that's exactly true, but the point is that's the bottom line anyway. I think it is true that there is certainly sovereign bias today, particularly because of the question that you opened with.
And so, because you're based in the UAE, I imagine the question has popped up. You're a global provider. I'm sure people have asked that question of, what does it mean for us that you're based there? I understand that you've put in place some transparency measures to sort of open up a little bit more and let people in so they get over that. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Sure. I think one of the complex things in cybersecurity is knowing what's inside the box. I mean, we certainly are seeing that with Spectre, and we're seeing that with other things through the last couple of decades. And certainly that's also why the open source movement has been so popular, let's say, in security circles. So one of the things that we mostly provide services, but the products that we do build, one of the things that we announce publicly is that we would make the source code available to anyone who wants to buy the product, and we would give them full access to every single line of source code for full review, full testing, and so on. And I think that's a really important aspect, particularly for security researchers that are interested in, there must be something here that I'm not seeing. Certainly, I could tell you that in my career, there's always a suspicion about things. So I think that kind of transparency is really important. And I would encourage other companies to do that as well. There's certain conditions, of course, associated with that, because some things are proprietary, but there's no extrinsic conditions. In other words, everything is open. There's no but you can't see this. It's 100% open.
Obviously, it's still early days. GDPR just goes into application this week. But so far, would you say, and maybe Floris, you can answer this, would you say that the rules that have been enforced more and more and sort of toughened up to ensure cybersecurity, data privacy, would you say that they're actually helping make the cyberspace more secure?
I always like to have a bit of nuanced answer. So overall, I think the answer is yes. Because if it did one thing, at least brought it to management attention. I still think over time, it could actually become a distraction because we go back into a compliance-based approach. We say, oh, we're GDPR compliant, so we're secure. Right. No, you're not. Right. Because GDPR doesn't talk about your crown jewels. It doesn't talk about your critical asset. It only talks about data that's important to your customers, which is important, and you need to take care of it. But at the moment, it's basically things that companies should have done anyway to build trust are now becoming mandatory, and they get a hefty fine if they don't do it. So from that point of view, it's helping. In a couple of years, we need to move, well, probably sooner than a couple of years, but we need to move way beyond GDPR.
Yeah. I would say, I mean, I echo what Francis is saying, because to me, most of these regulations are bringing the security hygiene. I mean, GDPR brings a part of the security hygiene, which should be anyway doing data encryption, ability to identify data exfil, and having the recovery procedures, response procedure. That should be. And if you're operating in multiple countries, like we also have a cloud product. So in our case, some of this compliance as we go is also part of our, we want to increase our security maturity. So whether it's an ISO or a CSO or a D4 regulation in the US, and implementing a NIST framework, 171, it's a very comprehensive framework for security implementation. So part you take it as a regulation, but part is really your security hygiene.
Someone is asking in the audience, and going back to the consumer and individual side of things, do we trust US companies less than European companies because there are no big social networks that come from Europe? What do you think about that?
I think there's a little bit of that. I mean, we haven't seen as many breaches or exposures with European companies as we have in the US, just because some of the biggest companies are US based. We'll get our fair share.
We have a few minutes left only, and I really want to end on a word of advice for any executives or entrepreneurs in the room. So what would be the best advice, spinning things forward, looking at the next 2 or 3 years within the space of cybersecurity? What's the sort of the key thing that executives should have in mind in trying to maximize protection and minimize friction within their companies? What's the key thing that you would advise them to keep in mind?
Yeah. I'll start with that. I think that Floris's point is a building block for that. I think compliance is really an important aspect, but compliance is the floor. Really, it's looking at, okay, we know a lot of these things really haven't worked for a long time in terms of stopping, the bad guys, let's say. So how do we start looking at, strategy and frameworks that really take us exponentially to the next level? So when we talk about things that have been discussed all day here today, like AI and machine learning, which organizations really are making progress there in certain problems that protect the crown jewels? When we talk about blockchain, and blockchain is an amazing, again, underpinning technology like TCP/IP or something like that, who's starting to build applications that are relevant on the blockchain that can help solve security problems? And I could keep going, but there's a list of enabling technologies, but you still need strategy, framework, a roadmap that matches your digitization aspirations and goals for the organization.
Yeah, and maybe you were asking specific advice for some of the entrepreneurs and companies that are starting in this era, and maybe a bit strange advice coming from a security guy, but I would say embrace the cloud. Don't try to do everything yourself. I mean, those cloud providers, the good cloud providers, they really know and have the resources to do security well, so they will do it well. And on the friction point, think from a consumer point of view. Security should be about consumer experience, customer experience. Identity management, we've always hated multiple passwords and stuff like that. Well, we can fix that with proper identity management, which, by the way, is still the cornerstone of good security. So have a good identity management in place, fix the basics, but you can fix the basics by basically going to the cloud.
Meerah, your final words of advice?
So I agree for both the points. There's no one size fits all. It really goes back to what is your business, knowing your business, knowing your data, what is your crown jewel, what's your IP that you want to go after, and really making sure that you're adapting a framework that's actually becoming your base for the implementation. I'll go even one step further. Many times, in companies, either the IT or the CISO organization, they could be one and the same organization or the only people trying to be the security. To me, it's not IT or it is not the CISO is the security. advocate in the company. It has to be everybody. So security awareness and training, they're equally important. If you look at every breach, the breach didn't happen just because the system was left open. It's always a human, someone clicking on an email or someone not being secure enough, opening the door for the bad guys to come in. So education is something that I would say, make sure that apart from your strategy, add it with the right education, make sure that you're having frequent briefing with your executive team so it's not one person's effect.
All right, we could talk about this for days, but that's all the time we have. Thank you to the three of you.
Meerah.
Thanks to the audience for joining in.